Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frederick Winsness, and I'm with NetHope Solutions Center. Pleased to welcome everyone to another webinar in our series. Today we have Facebook and the NetHope Crisis Informatics team presenting on disaster maps, and this is a first in a series of 3 webinars. We'll talk a little bit more about the upcoming webinars in a few minutes. Before we get started, I want to go over our normal housekeeping rules. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please line up your questions in the chat window. You'll find the chat window in the icon third from the right on the bottom of your screen. You can there also observe other people's questions and partake in conversation as we go through the hour today. We will reserve about 10-15 minutes towards the end of the 45 minutes today for question and answers. You'll you should know that this is being recorded, and we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording link as well as pointers to the collateral that will be posted on the NetHope Solutions Center. And at the end of the session today, you will see a online survey, a webinar satisfaction poll. We'd certainly appreciate it if you took a couple minutes to answer those questions, and that'll help us improve this webinar series as we go forward. Well, without any further ado, I want to introduce Gabrielle Allman. She is with the NetHope Crisis Informatics team here at NetHope, and she will introduce the speakers. Over to you, Gabby.
Wonderful, thank you. Excuse me. Welcome and greetings to everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Gabby, and I'm a member of NetHope's Crisis Informatics team. This is the first webinar of a 3-part series meant to introduce you to Facebook's Geo Insights platform. This first webinar will provide an overview of what that platform does, while the following 2 will be more technically focused, so walking through the user interface and understanding how to pull and utilize the data that's in there. In order to proceed to the next 2 webinars, your organization will need to review and agree to Facebook's data sharing agreement, which covers their privacy standards and policies. And we'll talk more about that in this webinar. As a note, this webinar is being recorded, so you can refer back to it later, or you can share it with others in your organizations who want to learn more about what this platform is about. We ask that you share this link with your colleagues working in different time zones, so those working in Latin America, the Middle East, and in Africa. Now to introduce our 2 speakers. Laura McGorman manages Facebook's Data for Good portfolio. Prior to joining Facebook, she's held positions at the U.S. Department of Commerce, OPower, the World Bank, and USAID. Paige Moss is the data scientist on Facebook's core data science team and helps create disaster maps that humanitarians can use to support communities recovering from disaster. Prior to Facebook, she earned her PhD in biostatistics from Johns Hopkins University and completed a postdoc at the National Cancer Institute. So now we're going to hear from Laura. Off to you.
Thanks so much, Gabby. I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen. And can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Laura McGorman, and I am a public policy research manager focusing on data for good at Facebook. I wanted to kick off the conversation today by telling you a little bit about Facebook's history in disaster response. We launched a feature called Safety Check in 2014, which allows individuals who use our platform to check in with friends and family to let them know that they're safe during a natural disaster. 2 years later, we launched a tool called Community Help, which allowed people to actually post and request for help of specific types, things like baby supplies, animal supplies, food, and shelter. And since the launch of Community Help, 750,000 people have used this tool and receive an average of 4 responses to each post. Then this year, we launched a tool called Crisis Response, which serves as a one-stop shop for both organizations and individuals seeking to figure out if they can see if their family has checked in safe in one place, It also allows organizations to pitch in. You can see here that Lyft used our crisis response page for Hurricane Michael to post a promo code allowing individuals affected by the hurricane to receive free rides. Now, based on these products we've built over the last 4 years, it's quite clear that the Facebook platform itself has been used in the context of natural disasters and can prove a very important tool in those contexts. But we also had questions about whether or not our data itself could help fill critical gaps during the first hours of a crisis. Alongside this question, we also wondered, how could we transmit this information to the right people at the right time while preserving privacy? I'll hand over the next few slides to my colleague, Paige, who can tell us about the different types of maps we've generated using Facebook data.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. As Laura mentioned, I'm going to give a high-level overview of the different map types that we make available during a crisis. I'll talk a little bit about the data and methodology that goes into creating these maps, as well as give a few concrete examples of actually what the maps look like so you have a sense of what we're talking about. So to jump right in, when a natural disaster happens, we consistently produce 6 different map resources. The first is our location map. You can think of this as a dynamic population density map that shows where people are located in the crisis region during the crisis compared to where we expect them to be. We also provide a movement map that addresses the question, how are people moving during the crisis? We provide a connectivity map, which shows where people do and do not have network coverage access in the crisis region. We also have a power availability map. Concretely, this map shows where people are able to charge their phones or not. And the idea is that this map can be used to understand whether the underlying power infrastructure has been disrupted by the crisis. Our safety check map takes that individual level signal of people telling their friends and family that they're safe and aggregates it to the population level to show across the region where people are checking in safe versus areas maybe where there are fewer people checking in safe. And then finally, our displacement map is more of a long-term resource that looks at the city level across the region to see whether people have been displaced from their homes and need to move to different cities, and then follows the data over time, over weeks and months, to see if people are able, having been displaced, to return home. So those are the 6 maps resources that we provide. To talk a little bit about the data that actually goes into creating those maps, the data that we use is location records, so latitude and longitude pings from people who have the Facebook mobile app on their phones. These are people who have opted in to share their location history with us. And in order to receive sort of the data on where they're located, they also need to have connectivity and their phone turned on. And as you may have noted with our connectivity map, we sort of leverage this fact by learning from the gaps. So if we see a big drop in the number of people we're able to detect through connectivity issues, we can sort of surface that and say, okay, this is a region that has lost connectivity associated with the disaster. So to talk a little bit about the methodology, one thing that we want to do in creating these maps is make sure that they are privacy preserving. And so what we do is there are a few different techniques that we use to go from that individual level location ping data that we have up to a population level resource that's actually more useful for organizations. And we do that through aggregating to the population level, as well as adding some smoothing and filtering steps along the way. So to make that concrete, if this left panel is the location ping data that we have, what we do is click, we overlay a raster grid, click, and then we can count up the number of people we're observing in different cells across the map and create a heat map out of sort of where the population is located. And it's this count level information aggregated up that we share, not the individual level data. And one point I want to make here is that the heat map is also, in addition to being more privacy preserving, is more immediately useful, sort of to your eye. You can see in the heat map areas with denser population more easily than you could in that leftmost panel as well. So click. There are a few other features that go into the privacy preserving approach, one of which I mentioned is aggregation to large tiles across the region. A second is that we are co-developing these resources with trusted partners. We hope that some of you on this call will become our future partners, and these are definitely resources under development. So we're always eager to hear from partners about ways that we can make these maps more useful to your organization and your particular use case. The goal here isn't just to sort of dump data on you, but to actually do some processing on our end to get that data closer to insights that you can use and leverage right away. And in addition to having a privacy preserving approach to creating the maps, we also want to share this data in a privacy preserving way. The way that we do that is through our Geo Insights portal. So each of these 6 maps that I've talked about is generated automatically as soon as we become aware that a natural disaster is occurring. And these maps are produced dynamically over time as a crisis unfolds. So in the hours and days, and with the displacement map, weeks and months after the disaster begins. And the maps are automatically hosted into this Geo Insights portal, which you'll hear a little bit more about how to get access. And the idea there is you and your organization can use that portal to either look at the maps in the sort of UI that we provide and interact with them there. And then that UI also has some download functionality, so you could pull these maps in with your own resources as you're making decisions in crisis response. So now I'm going to go through just a few concrete examples of what these maps look like and how they would actually look in the tool if you had it in front of you. So this is an example of our location map, or what I refer to as our dynamic population density map. This is an example from Typhoon Damre in Vietnam. In this particular case, the metric that's being visualized compares the number of people that we see in an area during the crisis to the usual pattern in the baseline. So the red here shows areas where we're seeing far fewer people detected than usual, and the blue is where we see more people detected than usual. So with this typhoon, what we can see is the coastal region, we see many fewer people in that area than usual. And with our location map, we create this map every 8 hours. And so what we can do is sort of click through time and not only observe areas that are currently disrupted, but we can see over time as some of those patterns go back to normal, back to the more white color. And we can see which regions are recovering faster and maybe which other ones are still disrupted. Next. This is an example of the movement map resource that we provide, or visualizations you can make using that data. Our movement map tries to visualize how people are moving, so from one tile to another, servicing the number of people making a particular movement. In this particular example with Hurricane Harvey in Texas, that first panel, the lower left starburst that you see sort of away from the coast shows people leaving this small coastal city near where the hurricane did eventually make landfall. In the second panel, we see movement up from 2 major cities closer to the coast, more inland, up to Dallas. And then eventually what we see is people sheltering in place as the hurricane actually arrives. And so what this shows is sort of how you can use these maps and step through time to understand what's sort of going on the ground. Next. This is an example of what the connectivity map would look like in our Geo Insights portal. The first panel is an example of showing the connectivity situation prior to the volcanic eruption in Guatemala. And the second panel shows the connectivity map after the volcanic eruption. And so from this, organizations can not only understand where people are not having connectivity during the crisis, but also have an understanding of which areas did have connectivity before the event began. Next. And then finally, this is an example of what our longer-term city-level displacement map looks like in the GeoInsights portal. In this particular case, this example comes from looking at displacement data during the Napa Valley fires. So in the sort of upper portion of the map, the cool colors, such as green, blue, and purple, show cities that have seen a drop in the number of people there after the crisis, or sort of during the crisis. And then the red areas are the major cities sort of around the affected region that saw an influx of people as people were displaced from the Napa Valley region. And then again, this map is produced over time so we can see as these people are able to eventually return home. And then finally, one feature I wanted to highlight in all of the methods that go into these maps is a strength of the data that we have is that we're able to not only look at what the patterns look like related to connectivity or battery charging or population density. We can look at that not just during the crisis and after, but we also can compare what those patterns look like compared to usual. So compared to what the natural patterns were before any crisis event happened. And we think that's a real strength of understanding what's going on. So with that, hopefully you're excited to work with some of these map resources. And I'm going to pass it back to Laura to talk a little bit more about how some of these resources have been used in the field. And then finally, how you all can join us and get access to the GeoInsights tool to start working with these maps.
Thanks so much, Paige. So Disaster Maps has been live since June of last year, and the first major disaster that we put our insights into action was during Hurricane Maria, which I'm sure all of you know had a massive impact on the island of Puerto Rico. We worked with several of our partners in the response to Hurricane Maria, and we were able to use our insights in a meaningful way, and I'll show you exactly how Disaster Maps data rendered in GeoInsights around the time of crisis. So here you can see a baseline map of Facebook users spread across the island of Puerto Rico, which shows that we're basically experiencing life in normal times. This is 2 days before Maria, September 4th, 2017. 3 weeks after Maria, you can see a substantial drop in the number of Facebook users. And then even 8 weeks after Maria, we're all able to see the long-term impact of the hurricane on the island of Puerto Rico with massive drops in Facebook users due to very low network coverage in the region. This data was used by a number of our partners. The first example I'll walk through is actually work that we did with our collaborators for this webinar, NetHope, where we used connectivity data from our Facebook maps, which then NetHope was able to use to guide their effort to restore connectivity to the island. And over the course of weeks and months, nearly 100 Wi-Fi hotspots were installed using Facebook connectivity data to guide the installation of where those Wi-Fi hotspots should be placed. Similarly, the American Red Cross also used our connectivity data to restore connectivity to some of the districts in the eastern part of the island. And they were able to create maps using Facebook connectivity or network coverage data as a layer, and then also layer over the locations of their VSAT reunification sites. And I think in both of these cases, it shows that the power of Facebook data is most profound when combined with the insights of our partners working on the ground. We believe we can provide a layer of situational awareness and hopefully a layer of information useful for decision making, but it is most powerful, and in fact it is only powerful when our partners on the ground make use of it to make decisions in their response activities. Another recent example was during the Kerala floods, which quite recently displaced over 1 million people in India. In Kerala, we're working with an organization called Seeds India, who is using our displacement maps to track the movement of people away from the areas affected by the floods. As Paige mentioned, you can see the cooler colors showing where people have migrated away from, and the darker colors showing where people have significantly increased in population at a city level. The way this information was used was Seeds India was able to govern their communication strategy with these insights as the backbone. You can see here in a particular district in Kerala, they saw very significant changes in population away from the flood-affected zones. But then as people on August 21st and 22nd started to return home, they knew that they could switch their messaging to ones that were about returning safely back to school and safely back to home. And they're able to use our movement data to figure out both the timing and the content of that communication strategy. Lastly, the volcanic eruption in Guatemala is another example, which Paige alluded to earlier in the presentation. In this particular circumstance, we worked with UNICEF, who uses a tool called U-Report to send messages via Facebook Messenger to youth about a wide variety of topics, including in the context of Guatemala when it was safe to go back to school. When UNICEF first reached out to Facebook, they were unsure if they could even reach anyone with an online message, given hypotheses that the volcanic eruption had completely wiped out network coverage in the affected areas. As it turned out, our network coverage maps showed that the vast majority of areas in the affected districts still did have network coverage. And as a result, they were able to send many more thousands of messages than originally anticipated through Facebook Messenger to youth in the affected districts. And quotes from kids who received messages via Facebook Messenger included comments such as, "We want to know when we can go back to school," said Michelle. "So if you could send this kind of information to my phone, that would be brilliant." And another 17-year-old, Louise, basically said that they wanted to know what's going on. So it seemed like a great thing to be able to hear from groups like UNICEF via Facebook Messenger. In the past year, we've activated maps for over 100 disasters, and we've been actively involved in the response for many of them. Other examples include several California wildfires, where we've worked very closely with a group called Direct Relief, who's used our data to distribute hundreds of thousands of respiratory masks. We've also been working with various partners in the region in an ongoing fashion to the response to Typhoon Mangkhut, and most especially now in the United States in the response to Hurricane Florence. We have about 20 NGO and research partners, and hopefully following today's call, we'll have a number more. Transitioning to how you become a disaster maps partner. So I'll walk through a fairly simple timeline. So the first thing that we're asking people to do is to attend this webinar, and all of you are doing that. So congratulations, thank you. You've completed the first step. The second step is to confirm that you work on natural disasters. It can be misleading when we talk about disaster maps. Disasters are far-reaching as a term, but right now the tool is built only to generate data for natural disasters and not necessarily for civil conflict or man-made conflict. So just to let you all know, if you're someone who never works on natural disasters, this may not be a helpful tool for you because the insights are only generated in those contexts as of today. The next and most important step is that you have to sign a data sharing agreement. Now, as Paige mentioned, all of the insights in disaster maps are aggregated and privacy preserving. So there's nothing personally identifiable about the data, but it still is sensitive. And as a result, we do require a data sharing agreement, which basically means that you're going to use this information in the context of your work, and you're not going to share the information, and we can explain exactly what information you can and cannot share. You're not going to share sensitive information from the GeoInsights portal with people who aren't working in disaster response. One caveat here is also to mention that our data sharing agreement is something that's set up for nonprofits to share, to sign, out of the box. If you're a member of a public sector agency, like a government agency at a state level or a city level, that does require a slightly more long-term creative process because typically we have to develop MOUs with those organizations. So feel free to follow up with me and Gabby after the webinar if you are a member of one of those organizations, and we may need to have a slightly longer conversation about how to sign you up to be a partner. The last thing I'll say about the data sharing agreement process is that this is unfortunately where many well-intentioned partnerships actually do get blocked. I can tell you that we do have a very wonderful commercial counsel who does care about data for good. However, we are not staffed to develop custom data sharing agreements with every organization that wants to work with us. It's just not possible. So we would ask that you, if you want to become a Disaster Maps partner, that you work internally with your legal teams to try to take our data sharing agreement as close to as baked as possible, because that will just enable us to start working together faster and start actually saving lives with data, which is what we're all here to do. The next step after you sign a data sharing agreement is to figure out who the users within your organization are. Because this data is interesting, many people at the beginning of a Disaster Maps partnership may ask for logins to our Geo Insights tool, but I can tell you based on experience that there are actually 3 groups of people we've found so far who tend to be the most effective people to actually be using the tool. One is a GIS officer or a crisis informatics officer. So teams who are typically already working in ArcGIS or QGIS and who have sort of mapping related activities in their portfolio, those are very, very good people for us to work with in your organization. Another group would be a digital communications manager. So to go back to the Guatemala example, because our network coverage data is very powerful for determining who you can send online messages to, groups working in crisis communications and digital communications tend to be very, very strong and effective partners of ours. And then the third are members of what we would call either data or innovation teams. Teams like we work with the innovation team at UNICEF, who is mostly focused on the development of special projects. And so sometimes groups like those can be very good partners for us because their mandate is to use new tools in the context of the work that they do and disseminate those tools more broadly in those organizations. So using that context, after you sign a data sharing agreement, it's usually a good thing to figure out who the right people are who actually need logins to our tool. Once you tell us who you want to have a login, you get access to Geo Insights. Basically, we set you up with a login via an email address, which is linked to an existing Facebook account. And at the same time, we would also invite you to join our Slack group, which is how we communicate with our partners in real time. Because when disasters are ongoing, as everyone on the call knows, we need to be able to communicate in near real time with each other. And we've set up a Disaster Maps Slack group to enable that. And once all of those pieces of the puzzle are in line, we can start disaster mapping. This is my begging chihuahua. Just to reiterate the point I made earlier about data sharing agreements. I have been working on this project for some time now, and we really, really do want to work with everyone on the call, but we won't be able to do it if we can't, in a streamlined way, get through the data sharing agreement process. So just to underscore that the goal here is for all of us to be able to work together and not let agreements get in the way of doing good work together. So just underscoring the importance of that. Quick rules of the road. As I mentioned earlier, our data sharing agreement does have specific rules about what you can and cannot share from disaster maps. And the rules around this are pretty straightforward. I'm going to provide 2 examples. One is a map that you use Facebook data to create a layer in. This is an example of a map that was made by Direct Relief for the California wildfires that used a combination of Facebook location data and the actual information on where the fires were taking place. The other is a CSV download from disaster maps, which has the exact numbers of people, smoothed estimates, I should say, on per tile of people, and all the raw data. So I'm imagining that it's fairly straightforward what the answer to this is going to be, but sharing a map, like on the left, is totally fine. Sharing a download of the data from GeoInsights, not fine. And basically the thinking here is that derived products from disaster maps, there's really nothing worrisome about sharing that information, because at the end of the day, a static map is a pretty safe thing to be sharing with partners even who don't have data sharing agreements with us. But raw data that could be passed around to any number of people is not okay to share. And so when you sign our data sharing agreement, you're essentially agreeing to those terms. The last thing I'll say to outline next steps is that if you'd like to become a Disaster Maps partner, we ask that you reach out to Gabby, the host of today's webinar, and she can coordinate with us about how to get you on the platform. And then to let you all know that after you sign a data sharing agreement, the next webinar, which is actually on using our population density information to do your own analyses, is on October 17th. So we ask you to please join us. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to questions.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Laura. And Frederick and I will be sharing some of the questions that have come into the chat box since we started. So for the first question, you mentioned the data sharing agreement. And one of the questions that we have is, how long is that data sharing agreement?
It is 2 pages. It is straightforward.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And also a question that we have is, what determines or triggers Facebook to start producing these maps for various crises around the world?
That's a great question. We actually work with an international alerting framework that's shared by a group called NC4. And that information is shared with our global security team. So anytime a major natural disaster happens, our global security team gets an alert. Then once that alert is received by our global security team, there is a threshold that we apply that basically shows there's a sufficient number of people checking in safe in order for there to be enough data for Facebook to be able to share a meaningful map. And once a threshold number of people check in safe, we start generating data in the GeoInsights portal for a natural disaster. So that's the automated fashion. Every once in a while, if that process doesn't work, we also have what is essentially a manual process to kick off a map using a bounding box. But I would say 75% of the time it's an automated fashion that's governed by the workflow I just described.
Excellent. There was a couple questions on your data portal. Clement asks, in your data portal, how often are the maps refreshed? Are they dynamically generated with every request, or do they have a periodic refresh rate, say 6 to 12 hours?
Great question. So the data is refreshed every 8 hours, but the maps generate on a slightly longer time scale. So what we typically tend to push our partners to are daily refreshes. So we have both real-time maps and then what we call our daily maps. And generally, our partners use the daily maps, which are refreshed every 24 hours.
Great. One more question from early on. I think it was for Paige. The question is, by connectivity, do you mean that they have to have their mobile data turned on? In the developing context, most of the population tends to turn their mobile data on and off as needed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's sort of 2 answers depending on how you're thinking about it. So for the connectivity map, one thing that I want to make clear is the way we create that map is trying to infer whether particular cell towers are up or down, and then use that information to generate the map. And so that's based on many users sort of connecting to a tower in the historical period as well as during the crisis. But from the perspective of an individual phone, you're right that we need connectivity to receive the location ping information. However, that information is cached on the phone. So if a user had opted in to provide location history and they were sort of part of our set, even if their connectivity was turned off, their phone would sort of be caching this location information, and then when they did turn it back on and connect, we would receive that data. And since we generate these on a daily basis, as long as sort of within the day the person had turned it on, they would end up appearing in the map. Hopefully that answers the question, but if not, I'm thinking chat in the window and I'm happy to answer further.
There were a couple other questions on the maps, since we're on that topic. How does the movement map show directionality in quotes?
Sure, that's a great question too. So it was probably hard to see from that graphic, but the movement vectors that we provide do have like little arrowheads on them, and in the portal you'd be able to see that, so showing direction. We also differentiate between the starting point and the end point of the vector. And one useful way I've seen some partners visualize that data is actually coloring the movement vectors on the basis either of kind of where the starting point is or the ending point. And that can help the visualization do a better job of showing where the sinks and sources are in the map by using sort of the color parameter sort of creatively.
Great, and I think we have time for 2 more questions. Excuse me. So one of these questions comes from Catherine, who asks, has this mapping process been applied to other setting crises that cause, excuse me, displacement, such as political unrest or violence that has shut down an area or shelling incidents in the war?
Thanks, Gabby. It's a great question. So I believe I mentioned this during the how do I sign up slide, but right now we only do generate maps for natural disasters. Maybe in the future there might be a world in which we would generate maps for other use cases, but right now we are firmly focused on natural disasters for a wide variety of reasons. So the short answer to that question is no.
Thank you.
Back to the mapping issues, there was a question from Rory. Is the data only provided on this platform as a map, or are there APIs or anything else we can use to bring the data into our own applications and visual tools?
Great question. So right now, there are a number of ways in which you can ingest disaster maps data into other tools like ArcGIS, QGIS, and any number of other mapping tools. We offer downloads at the map level in CSV and GeoTIFF format, and we're currently trying to scope what a protected API could look like. An API for disaster maps does not currently exist, but we are trying to make data extracts for the partners that want to do their own transformations easier than it is today. But certainly our partners, in the vast majority of cases, are using downloads in either CSV or GeoTIFF to create their own maps, because we know that to use this many use cases described today, that it's usually the combination of our data with other data sources that is the most powerful.
There was one question that I found quite interesting. Has Facebook assessed to what extent the demographics of your user base might skew indications or implications for the map data?
Great question. This is something we're actually actively working on with Stanford University, who's looking at a wide range of disasters from different parts of the world, and then overlaying various other data sources to see if the distribution of Facebook users matches what is considered the gold standard distribution of the population. We're learning from some initial findings that our distributions are pretty close, but I can certainly imagine in places like DRC, where we did try to better understand if the distribution of Facebook users could be useful in something like the response to the Ebola outbreak, we find that in certain places where there's very low connectivity, our map can be harder to get a signal from. So we are working to answer this question in a more detailed way, but it's something we're actively looking at and happy to partner with you all to certainly explore further.
Yeah, and I can speak to that as well. So when I think about representativeness of the maps, there are kind of a couple different dimensions that we'd want to be representative on. One is sort of spatial representation. And so there, one thing that we've pursued is looking at how the dynamic population density map compares to other static maps, maybe based on satellite imagery, for example. So comparing where we know there are buildings versus where we're detecting people. So we could identify dark areas where we don't have Facebook users. I think one thing that we do know is that we tend to be more over-indexed for Facebook users in urban areas compared to rural ones. So that's a caveat to know about. The other sort of dimension of representativeness that you alluded to, the question asker, is demographics. So we have been looking at how the location history users who go into creating these maps compare to the general Facebook population as well as the offline population. And as Laura mentioned, this does vary across the world. So in places like the US, we see things looking pretty representative in terms of gender and age, as well as even the phone types that people use. But in other countries, that can vary quite a bit. So far, what we've chosen to do is in these maps, just surface our best representation of the Facebook user data that we have, rather than try to do some sort of complex modeling or reweighting on our end to try to sort of extrapolate to that offline population. That's something that we're looking into right now, but we sort of wouldn't take that jump without consulting with our partners to make sure that the data is still usable if we did this kind of modeling, as well as we want to make sure that we can do a good job of it. So right now we're just sort of giving you the best representation we have, but possibly in the future, depending on how well we can do this reweighting using the demographic information that we do know about, we may develop the maps further in the future in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paige. Excuse me, and thank you so much, Laura, for your time. Thank you for everyone that's tuned in. We're going to come to a close right now, but there are a couple things to keep in mind. Excuse me. First, the next two webinars will be coming up in October, and those will go into actually showing you what's in the platform, how to access, utilize the data that supports your situational awareness activities, and you'll also hear from organizations like the Red Cross, Direct Relief, excuse me, and the World Food Program, showing how they've used the data and how they've navigated it to support their monitoring efforts. In order to view those, again, you'll have to review and have someone in your organization sign the 2-page data sharing agreement. In order to get that, please email me, and we will get that to you as soon as possible. But again, we want to thank you for your time. If we didn't answer your question, we'll follow up with you directly. If you think of a question and you weren't able to drop it in the window, just reach out to us. Frederick?
Well, thank you very much, Gabby. Thanks for producing this series. We're very excited about the next couple of webinars in this series, so stay tuned for that. As indicated, the next one will take place on October 17th, and details will be posted to the NetHope Solutions Center shortly. We also really appreciate if you take a couple minutes today to answer the few questions in the webinar satisfaction poll that will show up on your screen as soon as we end here. And then last thing is to thank Laura, Paige, and Gabby for a very, very interesting introduction to the whole concept. We'll get deeper into it as we go along. With that, we'll wish everybody a great rest of your day, and we'll be back in touch shortly. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.